Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third lecture of New 303, Hypotheses of the Unconscious. So, last lecture, we spent some time beginning to get into some of the basic arguments that we can offer around the sort of existence of the unconscious, both in terms of sort of processing arguments that we observe from disciplines like psychology and cognitive science, but also some experiential and phenomenological arguments, right? Some of these basic experiences that we have that seem to indicate that not all of our processing falls within the conscious field. We then moved on to talk briefly about Freud's sort of tripartite hydraulic sort of model of the psyche. And then we began to get into some of the distinctions between Freud and Carl Jung, who was Freud's sort of primary disciple and then sort of something of a rival, although the distinctions between them are often, I think, overestimated by the respective disciplines. They have a lot in common. However, there is, of course, a substantial sort of gap between them as well. And those distinctions are going to be increasingly relevant as we go through the material. So we started covering off Jung's kind of organic, his living and more multi-centered model of the psyche. And we are going to return to those things later in lecture. However, first, I want to take some time to establish a couple of concepts that are going to lay some of the groundwork for the theoretical material that we'll be dealing with later. So off the bat, very briefly, I want to talk about two concepts, and those concepts are internalization and mutual modeling. Internalization and mutual modeling. So internalization is a concept which we derive from the Soviet developmental psychologist Vygotsky. That's V-Y-G-O-T Sky, Vygotsky, V-Y-G-O-T-S-K-Y. So Vygotsky, in some ways, is a kind of developmental psych luminary, really kind of secondary only to Piaget, although his focus was somewhat different. And Vygotsky does sort of a number of interesting pieces of work in his career, but the primary thing that we're concerned with here is his notion of internalization and its relationship to play. So consider for a moment the ways in which we as children learn to take up material. Right? Very often it is the case that we do so in a state of play. We're not unique in this respect. You can easily watch other mammals engaging in the same thing. So one of the things that we find most endearing, for instance, about puppies or kittens, right? When you watch kittens, you watch them sort of engaging in sets of sort of play hunting, right? They wrestle, they pounce, they bite, not harmfully, right? But they're sort of mimicking the sorts of skills that they're going to be picking up later. And this is very common to see an elevated state of play in young organisms. It's not limited to mammals either. We see it in birds, et cetera. But this idea of play as a means of simulating, in some sense, skills that we're going to later require is quite common in the animal world. And humans are no exception to that. So you can think of numerous cases where kids engage in certain forms of make-believe, where what they're doing is, to some extent, internalizing codes of behavior and modes of action, right? So sort of the most famous version of this in a sense is like having a tea party or playing house, right? Which are behaviors where kids go through, they mimic in some sense the social norms of people around them, right? And they're using play as a practice space. Now, it's important to note here that when we are engaged in this state of play, play is always, by necessity, in a state of what I'm going to call as not, which is to say that any object that we're engaging in play is sort of simultaneously itself and not itself, okay? So, you can watch kids very easily sort of put a layer of imagination on top of things. And this includes things that are sort of relatively close simulations of actual things like dolls, right? Doll houses. So if you look at doll houses, right, the beauty of a doll house is typically when the objects inside of it are tiny working versions of the same thing. This is not limited, of course, to sort of doll houses. You see this in action figures and models and so on and so forth. For those of you who haven't seen it, I screen it every year in my course, New 302. But for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend a documentary called Marwen Call, which is a fascinating sort of documentary about somebody who is operating in this space, in this sort of space of dolls and of miniaturization, right? But the beauty of these sort of miniature versions, right? Tiny house, tiny furniture, tiny people, is that they resemble, and yet they are not identical to the objects, right? There is a delight in that. This is very often the case in the state of play. Things are treated as something, but they are not something. So play fighting is not the same as fighting, right? It has that double quality. We see that double quality turn up all over the place. So an example of this contextually that I like to use quite often is tickling, right? Tickling is a very strange state of play. It is a state of play, for sure, right? And the thing that's weird about tickling, of course, is that we simultaneously entertain being tickled as a state of threat, but also a state of not threat. It has this as not quality. And if you think about it, that's highly contextually dependent. So if you are walking home at night and somebody jumps out of a dark alley and grabs you by the ribs, you don't experience that as tickling. You experience it as a threat, right? Experience it as a threat. It's not fun. It's not tickling. For it to be tickling, you have to be quite comfortable with somebody. If somebody tries to tickle you and you are not sufficiently comfortable that you believe you're not under threat, you don't experience tickling. You just experience discomfort. However, if you are sufficiently comfortable and they go for this, they are mimicking a state of attack, right? Their hands are moving dangerously close to your vital organs in most cases, right? So they're kind of coming at you in this way. And if you consider how tickling feels, it has this strange dual property to it. It is simultaneously kind of pleasant and kind of unpleasant, right? It feels almost overwhelming and one wants to retreat from it, but it also feels good. It makes us laugh at, right? So it's a very strange sort of bivalent state. I like that example along with the example of sort of playing with toys because both of them capture this as not quality. When a kid picks up a stick and pretends that it's a sword, right? Within the context of their play, it is a sword, but it isn't actually a sword, right? The make-believe space is that things are as not. We're able to straddle this line, right? To entertain the two things simultaneously. And this is essential to the state of play, right? Because it is sort of a simulation. It's standing in for a set of activities. Now, when we're talking about internalization, right, it's not just about this play space where we're practicing activities, and we'll get into that in considerably more detail. It's also about just basic internalizations of sort of social codes and behaviors. So an example that I like to use fairly often, my sister's eldest child, when they were little, was really the only kid in the family at the time. This is, 20 years ago now, but was really the only kid in the family at the time. And we began to notice that they periodically would do behaviors that were sort of hard to understand, right? So they would sit down on the couch and immediately go, ugh, like this. This was so strange, right? People were like, why are they doing that? And of course, the answer to this question was that they spent so much time hanging around adults, right? Old, tired adults, who every time they sat down on the couch would do this exact thing, right? Sit down, and they simply internalized it, right? There was no question about whether or not they were sort of giving an authentic expression of relief, which is, of course, what the rest of us were doing, right? We were sort of getting off our feet onto the couch and giving an expression of relief. In their case, they were not giving an expression of relief. They were giving a conventional expression. This is the done thing. There are a great number of instances of this. Now, we can look at this a little bit in sort of an experimental context. So, for instance, there's a really interesting experiment that was conducted where they compared the cognitive capacities of chimpanzees to toddlers, to human toddlers. It's an interesting experiment. So here was the experiment. They got a kind of a puzzle box, okay? So, a puzzle box, and it had like a crank and some dials and a button and a little tray. And the idea was that what they did was they put a treat into the little tray, okay, and put it inside the box. And then in front of the chimpanzee or in front of the toddler, they demonstrated the working of this box, okay? So they would turn the crank and slide the slide and push the button, and then out pops the treat, which in the case of the kid was like, you know, a chocolate, an M&M, a candy, right? And in the case of the chimpanzee was a peanut, because they like peanuts. So, you know, they would crank the crank, slide the slide, push the button, pop out the little tray, and get the treat. So both chimpanzees and you know, kids are remarkably observant, right? So you would, you know, they would stand there, they would watch what the person does, and within a few tries, right, within sort of 2 or 3 observations, both the chimpanzee and the kid would be able to do this experiment. They would walk up to the box, they would crank the crank, right, slide the slide, push the button, pop the tray out, get the treat, the candy or the peanut, respectively. Okay, so chimpanzees and toddlers perform about equally well in this experiment. Okay, but the interesting part of the experiment is the second part, because in the second part, the box was transparent. So in the first case, the box is opaque. It's a puzzle box, right? You can see the mechanisms on the outside, et cetera, et cetera. But in the second instance, the box is transparent. And what's interesting about the transparent box is that it is quite obvious in the transparent box that the mechanisms that you've been manipulating on the outside, the crank, the slide, the button, have nothing to do with the tray that contains the treat at the bottom, right? They're not connected. They have nothing to do with it. They don't release the tray, right? The tray can simply be opened. So again, right, the experimenters would go through mimicking this set of, you know, crank the crank, slide the slide, push the button, pull the tray out. And the kid and the chimpanzee would both observe closely. The difference is that after doing this, the chimpanzee would basically look at the experimenter like they were crazy, walk up, open the tray, take the treat. The kid, on the other hand, the human toddler, would watch the same thing and then go up, crank the crank, slide the slide, push the button, and open the tray. Now, one explanation that we can give for this is that we could say, well, I guess children are stupider than chimps, right? That is one possible explanation we can give to this. It's like kids are engaging in this unnecessary action. But to interpret the experiment in that way, I think misses a key point about a difference between, in this respect, right, chimps and human beings. And it's that the kid, right, the chimp is going straight for the prize. It's like they can observe the mechanism. They're capable of causal reasoning, right? They, you know, look, and it's like, the rest of the stuff you're doing is useless. I just want the treat. So why is the kid still engaging in the behavior? And the answer is that the kid is, as a human being, internalizing those behaviors because they are biologically wired to make a bet on culture. They're betting that there is a reason that the adult is doing this, even though they cannot see what that reason is, right? That if the adults are engaging in this more extended task, there's good reason for it. They're making a bet on this, even though they do not understand what the causal relationship is. They internalize the full behavior, right? Regardless of the fact that there doesn't seem to be a causal link. They're making a bet. They're making a bet on, right, the sort of superior wisdom or superior knowledge, right, of the adult, of the elders. Now, if you consider that experiment, right, and you extrapolate a little bit, you start to get to all kinds of really interesting ideas, right, potential ideas about sort of cultural internalization broadly. The number of things that we internalize, despite the fact that we don't perceive a specific causal reason for those things. So an example that I like to use in this respect sometimes is certain kinds of sort of ritual behaviors, right, that people have in religion. So an example of this that I like to use sometimes is around sort of Christmas with Christians, obviously, okay? So, you know, if you talk to somebody who's Christian and they've got their home sort of decorated for the Christmas season in December, and, you know, let's say that they have a nativity scene, right? So what's a nativity scene? A nativity scene is a, you know, a small sort of arrangement of figurines, okay, which depicts some of the events which are sort of linked in the story of the birth of Christ, right? So, this is like the manger and the wise men and the angels and Mary and Joseph and the animals and whatever, right? It's a small sort of arrangement. It's a depiction of the birth of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. So if you ask somebody, right, if you go to a Christian's home, I played this game because obviously a bunch of my relatives are Christian. If you ask them, hey, what's the deal with the nativity scene? Like, what's it for? They can explain it to you, right, in quite a bit of detail. They'll say, well, this is the story of the birth of Jesus, and he was born in a manger, and these are the three wise men bringing gifts, and these are the, right? They can sort of point to the various parts of this thing and explain what the rationale is. Now, obviously, you can push on that rationale and say, yes, but why are you depicting it? And then things start to fall apart. But they can give you a basic explanation of what it is that they're doing in some symbolic sense, right? It's a depiction. It's a depiction of these events, which are important to the context of the religion, right? It's a ritual depiction. Okay, and then you can say to them, right, okay, good. And what's with the Christmas tree? And here will be the Christmas tree, and there will be gifts scattered around it and lights on it and ornaments and, a star or an angel at the top and, right, tinsel. And you'll say, so what's the deal with the Christmas tree? And they'll say, I don't know, we've just always done it. That's just what you do, right? So the answer to this question, of course, what is the deal with the Christmas tree, is that the Christmas tree is not originally a Christian idea at all. It's an adoption of a pagan idea that was sort of, subsumed, syncretically fused, absorbed, right? So as Christianity moved out of the original regions that it was in, and it started to go to other regions, it, saw fit to sort of absorb local festivals and local traditions, right? As part of a pagan conversion process, right? So why do people have a Christmas tree? Well, this dates back to pre-Christian pagan ideas. That's why they have a Christmas tree, because none of those things feature prominently, really, within the actual Christmas story. It's not part of the myth, right? You don't hear anything about a pine tree in the myth. It's not that somebody has a decorated tree anywhere in that story, right? And there are obviously some nods, right? There is an angel or a star at the top. That's somewhat representative, and there are gifts, and there were gifts in the story. So there are some linkages, but like the specifics of the decorating of the tree, which is often a highly significant symbolic act for people. In some cases, it may be the only form of Christmas decoration they do. They have a small, sometimes artificial, often artificial tree. So if you ask them, they will just say, I don't know. It's just what we've always done. It's what my family did. And they may reminisce. They may say, we used to set the tree up when I was a kid, and right. But the point is that their ability to sort of unpack the symbolism of that event is highly limited. It is mostly imitative. Now, there are a great number of things like this, if you consider it, right? Internalization is something that functions not only in terms of our, procedural skills and so on and so forth, but it also informs our language and our conceptual framework, right? We internalize language. So it's kind of obvious that we internalize language, and from multiple sources, right? We internalize the language that we speak from our local environment, and you can dump a kid into a kid that's in the right priming age. You can drop them into an environment in which multiple languages are being spoken, and they will pick those languages up, right? Although interestingly, accent, I believe, is actually absorbed through one's peer group. So not specifically through one's parents, which often explains why, like first generation immigrants will have kids that speak, of course, with a totally different accent than they speak with, right? Even though they're capable possibly of speaking two or more languages, they've internalized the specific pronunciations of the accent from peers, from local peers. So we internalize things differently. We'll come back to that question around language because it actually informs a bunch of interesting things. But the point is that this question of internalization, right, that Vygotsky is looking at, is this question of pulling in fragments of the culture, and often in an unquestioned way. Now, One of the sources, obviously, that we're going to do a huge amount of internalization from is our parents, our immediate family group, right? So we internalize, right, all kinds of behavioral cues, methods of interpretation, conceptual categories, right? We internalize all this stuff, but we also internalize lots of procedural things. We internalize a sense of how things are done, right? So in various ways, we internalize, turn the crank, slide the slider, push the button, even though we do not necessarily have a sense of what the utility of those things are. We're making a bet on culture. And this is a bet, obviously, that has served human beings very well, right, through evolutionary history. We internalize things, and even though we don't necessarily know why we're doing them, they are still useful to us. And a great deal of ritual falls on that side of the line. People don't have to have necessarily an exact sense, okay, of what the neurobiology of what they're doing, does for them in order to get utility out of those activities, right? So there is a distinction here, right, that we're kind of beginning to highlight between a kind of a conscious ritual and an unconscious ritual. There are certain sorts of practices and rituals that we undertake where we're engaged in a conscious feedback process with those things, right? We, perceive, right, at some level, we experience. There's a phenomenological thing that we are tracking. Meditation typically is in this category. Meditation is guided in a phenomenological way. We engage in the practice, we see effects, we adjust consciously, right? But there are all kinds of things that we're doing culturally and ritually that we're not really engaging in consciously. We simply do them and they have effects. And the bet that we're making there essentially is the bet of culture, that people before us, survived. So probably there's a good reason to do what they did in an imitative fashion. So again, you can think about this with, with my sister's eldest child sitting on the couch. There was another example, right, that I thought was really interesting when they were little, which was there was a period where they were attempting to master humor. Okay, they were attempting to master humor. And so they went through a period where what they would do is emit a kind of string of gibberish, right? And then laugh and say, get it, get it. So they would say, purple monkey, dishwasher, rocket, roller skates, get it, and then laugh, right? And of course, this got reinforced because the first few times they did this, everybody else laughed because it was absurd. But if you consider what's happening there, right, think about how a kid, generally speaking, is interacting with humor. What's happening a lot of the time with humor is that they're being told a joke, right, which to them is maybe a nonsensical transition. But the thing that was held in common was this moment of get it, right? That in some way, if you just emit a string of nonsense and then say, get it, it becomes a joke. They had picked up a pattern, right? Which was, well, I don't really understand what's going on here, but maybe that's the idea. And then get it, right? And suddenly it becomes a joke. Initially, this is funny and it rapidly stops being funny, but you can see how that reinforcement mechanism initially kicks it in. And you can see that all the time. Kids will make random jokes. Many of you will have experienced this. A kid will randomly say something that's quite funny, right? Often because it's absurd, everybody laughs, right? And then the kid will hammer that button over and over again, typically until their parent says, okay, that's enough, right? Because they've now told the joke like 5 times. There is a reinforcement thing going on, but there's also a kind of imitative question, right? Sometimes they will say a thing specifically because it's imitative in some way, even if the imitation is imperfect. Okay, so internalization, this means by which we sort of pull material into ourselves behaviorally, does not stop developmentally when we're little. It continues on. So I think a really interesting example of this, of course, occurs in education. So there's a really common phenomenon that one encounters with undergraduate philosophy students, for instance, okay, which is that it's not uncommon to get a philosophy paper from an early philosophy student that is clumsy. It's sort of full of jargon, and it's written, often it's overwritten, right? It's written in a way that is meant to use sort of vocabulary that's more sophisticated than the student is really right, is really competent to use. Yeah, but the point is they've endeavored to create something that sounds like, or that reads like, philosophy. Now, it used to be the case, okay, that it used to be the case, unfortunately, it's still the case pretty often, but it used to be the case that the sort of go-to thing was that when a student turned in a paper and it was of that form, you would drop the hammer on it and say, like, don't use language you don't understand, like, don't stop doing this thing, right? But to do that fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the internalization, which is that the student is attempting to model, and they're doing so imperfectly. Of course, they're doing so imperfectly because they don't yet have that stuff built, but they are still attempting to model, right? They're attempting to output what they see as being a kind of credible version. They're doing their best imitation. It is, in a sense, a fake it till you make it moment. And that brings us to sort of the second relatively important idea of Vygotsky, relevant for us, which is the zone of proximal development, right? The zone of proximal development. So what's the zone of proximal development? The zone of proximal development in Vygotsky is the idea that there is a sort of channel of optimal learning. So when you are encountering material and attempting to understand it, right, you always want that material to be slightly past where you're at. When you're sort of teaching language and vocabulary to kids, this becomes very obvious. You use language like a little past what they're used to. Why? Because they're required to then cognitively stretch to reach that. It's not so far above them. You're not talking about quantum physics that they're just like, I don't have any idea what's happening here. But it's just high enough above them that they have to start asking questions and making inferences. They have to sort of figure out what that means a little bit by context. And they're going to get that wrong sometimes. But the point is, you're teaching at a level that is just above what people can sort of easily, right, effortlessly handle. You're making them stretch just slightly to get to that. And that is the thing that sort of bootstraps growth, right? They reach towards that pulls them up a level. They reach towards the next thing, right? And you are constantly elevating just past where they are. It's the same thing, of course, when we are internalizing any kind of skill. We want to be in a state of challenge without that challenge being so intense that we are just completely overwhelmed, right? So if you're learning to play a game, if you're learning to play chess, or you're learning to play tennis, or you're learning to play, a computer game, and computer games excel at this, but video games generally excel at this. You want the difficulty of the task to be just beyond what you can easily handle, right? So that you are being forced to sort of stretch your skills. So, there isn't that much point if you are playing, chess or something competitively, to the idea of, constantly playing against people that you can just trounce, right? It's not useful. You want to be playing, in fact, people who are better than you at some level, right? So that you are stretching your skills. I had an interesting experience in this respect a number of years ago. So I'm long friends with a family. I've been friends with three generations of this family at this point. And this family is very bright, and they're extremely interested in strategy games. They love strategy games. They have boxes of strategy games. And periodically, they will get together, a number of the sort of brothers in this family, and the brothers and now the sort of, I guess, sons and daughters and nephews will get together and they'll play strategy games, like for a good stretch. Often over the winter holidays, they'll get together and play for like a week, right? They'll play different games, basically almost nonstop. So I've been invited to these games on a number of occasions, and I like strategy games, and I'm not a bad player by any stretch, but my skills are just nowhere near where their skills are at, right? They've played so many different strategy games, and they've played them, sort of so intensively that their ability to sort of grasp a rule set and see strategies within it is quite remarkable. So, I've been invited to a number of these things. And on one occasion, there was sort of three of us. It's an older brother, younger brother, and me. Us all being, I think, probably well, we were in our 20s. The older brother, I guess, would have been in his 40s or early 50s, maybe. So we're playing these games. And eventually I kind of tapped out, just because, frankly, I was getting my butt kicked like year over year over year. It was humiliating. And I don't mind that, but, after a while, it was a bit of a grind. They were just much, much better than I was, right? And I wasn't likely to be sinking in the kind of time necessary to develop the skills in question. But what I often noticed was that in these interactions, the older brother, was beating the younger brother, who's sort of the original friend. I'm friends with all of them, but this is the fellow that I've known the longest. He's a contemporary of mine from school. He would beat him like 2/3 of the time, maybe 3/4 of the time. Like he would beat him a lot. And the way that this unfolded each time was nearly identical. The younger brother would come up with some kind of new strategy. He's very quick. He would come up with some kind of new strategy. He would implement it, and it would be quite effective. He would get a win. And as soon as he did so, the older brother would sort of do an analysis of that strategy, co-opt it, sort of eliminate it in some sense from play, and use it against him and start winning again. And he would win far, far more often than not. He was very strong. So finally, when we were leaving one of these sort of game nights, I said to my friend, the younger brother, I said, I don't know how you can take it. Like, you're getting your ass handed to you over and over again. Like, I don't know how you can stand it. And he said something that I thought was very telling. He said, well, you don't learn anything when you win. You don't learn anything when you win. Now, this is actually very consistent with what we know about the cognitive science around problem solving. We'll get into that to some extent in more depth later when we look a little bit at insight and things. But it's true. You pick up far more, actually, if you are sort of unflinchingly examining cases of failure and error than you do from success, which just reinforces what you've already done, right? The growth arc is found in not getting there a lot of the time. So this is, in a sense, a kind of central idea, right, to the zone of proximal development. You want to be stretching just past where you are, right, so that you're not quite getting there, you're not easily mastering it, while not stretching so far that you're moving into a space of like anxiety and incomprehension and an inability to even grasp the material. Okay, so these two ideas from Vygotsky, internalization and the zone of proximal development, are going to be quite important moving forwards. And we'll come back around to them in a bunch of ways, but internalization, okay? This idea that we are internalizing, right? That is the primary means by which we're getting things, and that play is a state of internalization. It's an as not state of internalization, right? The means by which we do our learning. Okay, so that's concept one. Concept two, mutual modeling, So this is an idea that comes from Reid Montague, who's a cognitive scientist who has done sort of interesting and important work around artificial intelligence and consciousness. And Reid Montague's work played a quite important role in a bunch of the work sort of on the theory of consciousness that I worked on and co-authored with my friend and colleague, Dr. John Vervaeke. So the idea of mutual modeling, okay, comes out of Reid Montague's observations about the bioeconomics of the brain. You may be asking yourself, like, what the hell does this have to do with unconscious processing? But just stick with me for a minute. It comes out of the bioeconomics of the brain. Okay, so what do I mean by this? What I mean is that, the brain, as we know, is an enormous consumer of calories. We have to, eat a certain number of calories every day just to like fuel the machine. And that's regardless, right? We would have to eat a certain amount every day to fuel the machine, the body, regardless of sort of our level of physical activity. Obviously, if we're extremely active, we're going to have to, eat more. We're going to have more calories. But the point is that there's a finite budget. Now, in the modern era, often, certainly in the developed world, we often suffer from, of course, a massive surplus of calories. So the question of being overweight is often a much more salient social question in the developed world than being underweight, And we'll actually talk about that a bit later too. But for now, the idea is that we evolved, right, on something of a fixed budget. It's not always the case that you're going to have an unlimited source of calories to fuel. And that means that the system has to be economical, right? The system has to be economical. Now, it is already the case that the brain consumes an enormous number of our calories, right? A huge percentage of our calories just go to run in the brain. It's an expensive little machine, right? And, you know, that despite the fact that it runs sort of cold and slow, as they say, right? It's not running with the sort of blazing fast speeds of computer circuitry because that's extremely energy intensive. It's running a bit cold and slow. Nevertheless, it's capable of obviously tremendous amounts of cognition, right? Of processing, information processing, and problem solving. So Reid-Montague's point is, it's an interesting one that emerges from sort of the scope and scale of the human brain. Now, the human brain is big, right? Obviously, there are animals with bigger brains, but for a species of our size, right, the body to brain weight ratio is quite substantial. Our brains are big and they're complex. And on the scale of the neuron, right, of the individual components and connections right within the brain, on that scale, the neuronal and synaptic scale, the brain's enormous, okay? So one of the problems that the brain faces as it is attempting to go about its business, right, to get you through the day, is a coordination problem. There are all of these various processing centers and so on within the brain, right? And they have to have their actions coordinated in some way. You don't want all these different brain areas going off in different directions, so to speak. Although, as you'll see next week when we start touching on dissociation, it is part of the processing that does that sometimes. But for the most part, you want different areas of the brain to be acting in a coordinated fashion. So the problem that emerges in this coordination, right, is, well, how do they coordinate? How do these different parts of the brain coordinate? Now, you know, you may be thinking, you know, well, the brain's not very big, right? It's like three pounds of lukewarm oatmeal inside the bone box. But really, on the scale of, right, synapses, neurons, right, on the scale of the architecture of the brain, it's huge. These are vast distances that need to be covered. And so correspondingly, covering those distances requires energy. If you want to send a signal from one part of the brain to another part of the brain, it takes energy, right? It takes metabolic energy. The problem is this: if you want to coordinate all the different parts of the brain, you can't just have them in constant communication with each other. It's metabolically inefficient, right? It's metabolically inefficient. If all of the parts of your brain that needed to be coordinated were simply just buzzing with constant communication with each other back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth, right? This would burn through enormous amounts of calories. It's inefficient. So from a bioeconomical perspective, the idea of having the different parts of your brain across such a big space, right, within the brain, constantly communicating with each other is inefficient. It's bioeconomically inefficient. This is what Reid-Montague points out. However, you know, this also sort of brings up, Montague proposes, an alternate notion to this. And this is the notion of mutual modeling, right? Mutual modeling. So the idea is that rather than each part of the brain, okay, you know, being in a state of constant communication, constantly sort of being on the phone with another part of the brain. What are you doing now? Okay. What are you doing now? Okay. What are you doing now? Okay. Instead, what it does is it maintains a model of the other part of the brain, maintains a model. And that model behaves like the other part of the brain. Now, this is a distinction. We want to make a distinction here between a model and a representation, okay? So it's not a representation. It's not a static picture. It's not a set of facts. A model instead behaves like the thing in question, right? It is like a small working version of the thing in question that can be consulted, right? So instead of constantly sending communication, instead what that area of the brain can do is it can consult its mutual model, right? It can consult its model of that other area and be like, what would that area behave like? Okay, it would behave like this, I'll behave accordingly. Correspondingly, this other piece of the mind maintains, right, a model of this piece. right? So they each have within them a sort of a model, a working version, imperfect, but nevertheless, right, that can behave like and therefore sort of offer predictions, if you consult it, of what this other piece will do. And that massively reduces the amount of communication that you require between these two components in the brain. Each of them maintains a little model of each other, and they can consult the model rather than sending long-range communication. Now, it is obviously the case that periodically that model needs to be updated. Because if it isn't, then the gradually changing circumstances may eventually lead this model to be, right, badly off target in various ways. However, this idea that, right, that you can reduce sort of the long-range communication between parts of the brain by those parts of the brain mutually modeling each other, right, is an important kind of aspect of answering some of the problems of bioeconomics in this processing. Okay, so why is this relevant to our purposes? You may have already sort of guessed in this direction, but why is this relevant to our purposes? So the interesting thing is that mutual modeling, as John Vervaeke and I have dealt with it, is not strictly speaking limited to internal processing within the brain. Now, one of the reasons for this that needs to be considered, okay, is that in a sense, the parts of the brain are not distinguishing, right, other parts of the brain from external environment. And what I mean by this is that, right, like the components of the brain themselves are living things. A neuron is alive. It's a cell. It's alive. It doesn't do very well if you remove it from the rest of the brain, although we can keep them alive in a petri dish or something of that kind, right? The point is, it doesn't do very well outside the brain, right? It's not like it's going to go off and, pursue its own career elsewhere. But the point is that it is a living thing, okay? And given that it's a living thing, it actually exists in a state of Darwinian competition with the other cells in the brain, right? They compete with each other for resources, and they network together in sort of networks of mutual support, right? So, the extent to which a neuron fires is the extent to which it typically receives resources. If it doesn't fire, it typically kind of gradually withers up. The system doesn't support it. So in a sense, during competition, you can think of the movement of stuff in your brain, right? The movement of these cells that are growing and creating new connections and patterns with each other is a very Darwinian. For each of the brain cells, the brain is environment. For each of the brain cells, the brain is environment. That is the environment that they operate in. Other brain cells are their competitors or their collaborators, but the environment is the brain itself, right? In the way that, like, you could think about a bacteria swimming around on its own, right? The petri dish that the bacteria is swimming around in is its environment. Well, for each of your brain cells, the brain is its environment, right? And the resources that are available to it, right, are dependent on its relationships, often in competition and cooperation, et cetera, with other brain cells. Because the brain is environment for these things, and thus environment for larger sort of cooperative networks of these things, right, when they build up into more complex patterns, there isn't a primary distinction that these things would make between the internal environment of the brain and the external environment as brought in through the senses, through the eyes, through the nose, through the ears, through the nervous system, et cetera, right? It's all just environment. Everything outside of the boundary of itself is simply environment, and it's going to tend to interact with that in an environmental way. Now, one quick note here, because this often throws people. When I'm talking about sort of the brain and brain cells in this way, it's important to remember just how dynamic and organic and alive the brain actually is. So many of us still have an internalized model, right? We have this internalized image of the brain as being like a computer, like a mass of wires. So there used to be an anti-drug PSA that ran on TV, right, to try to scare kids off drugs. And it would show a picture of a brain, sort of a reproduction of a brain, right, that was made out of like colored wires. And it would say, this is your brain. And then it would say, this is your brain on drugs. And it would start, like a pair of wire cutters would start clipping all these wires all over the brain until finally it was like a sizzling, sparking mess of wires. This I think is not dissimilar in some ways to, and incidentally, that is not your brain on drugs. We'll talk about that later. But this is a model that lots of people have, that their brain is relatively static, like a computer. You know, you crack a computer open and all the parts are relatively static. They're all wired up in a relatively static way. You can see static connections between them, et cetera, et cetera. This is not, in fact, what's going on in the brain. So it's important to remember, and this is sort of the principle of neuroplasticity, which has received a lot of attention in the last 20 years. The brain is quite plastic. The individual cells and components are alive, and so they are breathing, they're moving, they're competing. It is less realistic to imagine your brain as being a mass of wires or a mass of circuits in that static way than it is to picture, and this often grosses people out a little bit, to picture a bucket of worms. Your head is more like a bucket of worms than it is like a static circuit system. Your brain cells are growing, changing, competing, connecting with each other, right? They're squirming, essentially speaking, around in there. I know that's a little gross, but bear with me. This is the idea of neuroplasticity. The important factor there for you know, sort of many people with neuroplasticity is that it means that the brain can be injured and it can sort of reconfigure itself around that problem, right? So anytime we're learning, anytime we're acquiring new skills, et cetera, the brain is sort of squirming and growing new configurations, right? New sort of specialized configurations of connections and patterns and so on and so forth. But it's also the case that if you have a serious brain injury, your brain can hypothetically sort of reconnect itself, re-network itself to accommodate that without a huge loss of functionality. And in many cases, this can be quite remarkable. People see sort of tremendous degrees of brain insult, but they recover enormous amounts of functionality, right? And it's because the system can sort of squirm, reconnect, reconfigure itself in various ways, okay? So bear that in mind with neuroplasticity. However, the question we're looking at is this question of mutual modeling. So in the same way as two regions of the brain, right, can improve their chances in a bioeconomical sense, okay, by maintaining little models of each other, it's also the case that regions of the brain can model the world in this way, right? That we can maintain mutual models, not just within the system, but in the way in which our minds, our brains are networked together. We can maintain mutual models of other people, right? And situations, but we'll get to that, right? But first off, we can maintain mutual models of other people. Now, what does that look like? So consider for a second, okay, the fairly kind of well-known in an anecdotal sense, right, notion that old married couples don't need to talk as much. This is an interesting example of mutual modeling, and it has been experimentally demonstrated. The longer a sort of married couple has been together, right, the less overt communication they require. Often they talk less, right? And yet they are still conveying important, essential information, right? How? They have developed and maintained a sophisticated mutual model of each other, right? The overt communication, long-range communication, no longer has to happen because they have a sense of, right? They have an internalized sense of what it is likely that the other person is going to do. They have a little version of that person in their head. They can predict their behavior in important ways, right? They can consult this model to predict their behavior. Now, that has obvious advantages, right? When you know, one of the spouses goes to the grocery store to pick something up, they don't have to text or call home every time to say, would you like this or would you like that? They have an idea of that person's preferences, right? They already have an idea of that person's preferences. And so, you know, overt communication sort of drops as they have this improved and more sophisticated mutual model of each other. Now, obviously, like mutual models within the brain, those models do require updating. If there isn't sort of occasional updating of the models, then you get situations where either people sort of, you know, they'll have a fight and there will be an outburst, right? Where it's, you know, the one person says, and you always buy fish sticks. I hate fish sticks. I've always hated fish sticks, right? They have failed to update the other person's model in some significant way. Or you'll get people where their communication has dropped and they have grown apart, right? And then you'll have things where somebody says, I don't even know who you are anymore, right? I don't even know who you are anymore. And what that means is like my internal model of you is no longer matching your external behavior. Something has not occurred in the updating of the mutual modeling, right? I don't even know who you are anymore. Okay. And that tends to signal a drop. But by and large, right, we see that communication, overt long-range communication between people goes down over time as they model each other. And many of you will have had some experience of this, right? You will have, to some extent, internalized your friends. As I, and your family, as I often sort of like to remark, right? It's always an interesting thing when you get to know somebody well enough that they turn up in your dreams, right? Behaving as themselves. And they may be speaking sort of nonsense, right? Whatever they say might be nonsense, and yet they somehow act just like themselves, right? So I've turned up in a number of my friends' dreams. And sometimes when they relate these dreams to me, it's very funny because, of course, the context of the dream is basically general nonsense, but it's not nonsense. We'll get to that too. But what I mean is that it's sort of, it's not the sort of conversation that would occur in real life. And yet they're like, and it was so you, right? And I've had the same thing, right? I've had, of course, many dreams about people where I'm like, oh my God, it was so you, right? It had that quality and the behavioral thing, right? And again, we'll come back to this when we deal with dreams in more detail, but when you are having a dream, obviously you are interacting with yourself. So what part of yourself are you interacting with when you encounter a version of somebody in a dream that behaves very similar to how they're behaving in the world? I'm going to propose that what you're doing is you're interacting with your model of them, right? Your mutual model of them. Now, this mutual modeling process in couples is something that you can sort of look at in a variety of interesting ways. So there used to be a game show. It hasn't been on in years at this point, but there used to be this game show. It had a few runs. I think it started in the 50s or the 60s, and it maybe had another run in the 90s, but it's been off the air for a long time. And this show was called the Newlywed Game. The Newlywed Game. You may or may not have heard of this thing. So the premise of the Newlywed Game was an interesting one. What you did was you took a young newlywed couple and you sort of separated them, right? And asked the one person questions about the other person, right? So you would, separate out the husband and start asking questions, right? And of course you would ask the wife the same questions, or vice versa. You would ask them the same questions, and then of course you would compare answers. And if they could get those questions right, then they sort of progressed up the levels. Probably they won money, I think, right? So you can see that in a sense, what the Newlywed Game is testing is mutual modeling. They would start out by tossing them, some slow pitches, what's their favorite color or something, right? And if you couldn't easily answer that question, then probably there was a fight when you got home that night. But, like the idea was that you could start out by asking sort of these simple questions and proceed up this chain to more and more complex questions. And the interesting thing about these questions was that they were not simply questions that could be answered propositionally. A lot of the time, they were questions which would never have been discussed or were unlikely to have ever been discussed. So what you had to do instead was consult the model. You had to consult this tiny internalized version of their personality and their behavior and make an inference, right? It had to make an inference. It had to make a prediction of how they would behave. You would consult your model and then you would say, well, I believe that they would behave in this way. And the better the model, the more likely your prediction was to match, right? So the Newlywed Game essentially is like the other end of this question of old couples engaging in mutual modeling, right? What you're doing is testing their degree of mutual modeling. Now, the idea of that game show, right, it's a curious kind of idea, right? You're, I guess, putting people's relationship under stress. But there is a sort of customary place where this question of mutual modeling actually occurs quite often, and it can cause quite a bit of friction in relationships. I've seen it with clients many times. And this is around the question of gifting. So gifting is interesting in this respect, okay, giving somebody a gift. So it's not uncommon, okay, in couples for there to be a gap in gifting ability. This is indeed something that I experience in my own relationship because I am a sharply inferior gifter to my partner. She has an extremely strong natural talent for gifting. And despite the fact that I consider myself to be a kind of empathic person, and I do have some personal material around this, the gifting situation in my youth and my family was a bit crazy, and I think it's left me with some complexes in that respect. But the point is, I am not as strong a natural gifter in some sense as she is. She's a very strong natural gifter. And this gap in gifting turns up in couples conflict a lot. Virtually every year when I talk about this, I'll have one or more people, say to me afterwards, "Oh my God, like this is exactly the situation I was dealing with," where they felt that, that they had given sort of thoughtful and insightful and penetrating, into the other person's gifts, right? That they had connected in some sense with the other person, but found that the gifts that they received in return were lackluster. So let's talk a little bit about gifting in this respect, right? Gifting is very interesting. So there is a thing which I refer to typically as the hierarchy of gifts. Hierarchy of gifts, okay? So at the bottom of the hierarchy of gifts are, loosely speaking, gifts that nobody wants, really, with rare exceptions, like scented candles from Chapter's Indigo or something, right? These are fully generic gifts that, or occasionally sort of joke gifts, often fall into this category, unless somebody really specifically wants like a singing plastic trout or something. This is just like, it's not a strong gift, right? So there are gifts that sort of like, it's just generic. It's a token. It's a token gift. Here you go. Here is a gift, right? Okay. Slightly up from that are gifts where the person has given you something that they themselves like, but not paying any attention to what you are interested in. Here you go. I got you a bowling ball, right? You've never expressed any interest in bowling. You may dislike a bowling, but they like bowling, and so here's a bowling ball, right? It's not really paid attention to your preferences in any way, but it's paid attention to their preferences, okay? Now, that can elevate slightly. Somebody can give you something that they really cherish. Here you go, this is a book that meant a lot to me, right? That's a meaningful gift, but it's coming out of their world, not yours, right? It may be the case that you are a reader. It might not be the case that you're a reader. It might be the case that you're sort of interested in that genre. It might not, right? A step up from that, okay, are the gifts that people get you because they paid attention to some token feature of your preferences, but they haven't tracked the specificity. So, that's like when somebody says, "Hey, I know you like to read. Here's a copy of The Secret." No knock on The Secret. The Secret is just mass market magic, although not especially skilled magic, in my opinion. We'll talk about that later too. I know you love books, so here's The Secret. And you may think to yourself, "Oh no, like why did you give me this?" A step up from that, of course, is, right, that they've paid attention to some deeper level of your preference. I know you love mysteries, so here's the Da Vinci Code, right? You may love the Da Vinci Code, you may hate it, but it hasn't paid close attention. It's like, I know you love mysteries, here you go. Okay, right. So they paid some attention to your preferences, right? They've attempted to get on that. And you can see that there are sort of fine variations there. That might be like, I know you love mystery novels. I loved this mystery novel. That can be a bit more meaningful. They're tracking your preference. It's coming from their world, etc. Okay. Now, a step up from that is when they've directly tracked some preference of yours, and then they move to meet it. "Hey, I saw how much you liked those yellow pants, so I bought them for you," right? This requires them to pay attention to something you said. You expressed an enthusiasm for the pants, so they go get the pants, right? They had to get a specific piece of information, right? Not sort of a broad preference, but then they recall that they moved to meet that. A step up from that is, "Hey, I saw how much you liked those yellow pants, and I think you might like these purple pants," right? Again, what they've done is they've extrapolated. They've, to some extent, they've made an inferential guess about your preferences, but to some extent, they're probably drawing on that model. And you can sort of tell, because if you do indeed like the purple pants, right, that might be chance, but it might also be the case that they have sort of gotten a successful read on you, okay? And then a step up from that, okay, is, going more broadly. I saw that you liked those purple pants, and I just think that this blouse would be great, or the shirt would be great, right? Blouse, it's not a word you hear a lot anymore. Anyway, this shirt would be great. Okay. However, all of this proceeds towards the kind of the crown jewel of the gifting world. And that is the gift that the recipient didn't know that they wanted, but was nevertheless perfect, right? And saying perfect kind of is begging the question a little bit, since it's the crown jewel. But you know what I mean? It's not something that they ever considered having until the person gave it to them. And very often you will have it be the case that the person who is gifting it will say things like, as soon as I saw it, I knew it was perfect for you, right? Now think about what's happening there for a second. What's happening is that they're encountering something in the environment, but they are not seeing it primarily in terms of their own preference. They're seeing it in terms of the internalized projected preferences of the other person. Their mutual model is seeing it basically and getting excited, right? This for them, right? You can see through their eyes. Now, that is a remarkable experience when people exchange a gift of this kind. And I can share an instance of this that I experienced that I found very telling. So a number of years ago, my friend and colleague, John Vygotsky, was coming up on a significant sort of jump in his career. He had just basically gotten a promotion to a permanent position. And so I wanted to get him a gift. It had been sort of deserved, frankly, and a long time coming. And I wanted to get him something that reflected this. And so I thought, I'd like to get John a gift. And then all of a sudden, it just sort of popped into my head, right? In some sense, sort of just received, out of nowhere. I didn't really have the conscious experience of sitting and being like, what should I get him? It just kind of came to me. And the answer was, I'm going to get him an Acheulean hand axe. Now, I had never before attempted to buy such a thing. I very rapidly went online, determined that there was an open market for them, and purchased one. What is an Acheulean hand axe, for those of you who don't know? An Acheulean hand axe is a prehistoric stone tool. It is a vaguely teardrop-shaped piece of stone that typically has been knocked and flinted to create this teardrop shape. And it was held in the hand. So this is before, tools would have had like an affixed haft. It was a sort of pointed piece of stone, right? A piece of stone that was flaked or napped or right shaped to be pointed, and it was designed to be used, right? Now there are lots of these things around, as it turns out, because they were the dominant form of tool use among human beings for like 1 million years or 1.5 million years. There are plenty of them, right? People would use them and discard them, and so there are archaeological sites where they've turned up all kinds of them. And indeed, as soon as I had the idea, as soon as it popped into my head, I went to eBay and I went to sort of ancient stuff, and I put in hand axe, Acheulean hand axe, and pretty rapidly I found one that had been part of a German collection in the late 19th century, and I purchased it for a surprisingly reasonable price. I had it shipped, and I gave it to John as a gift. Now, there are a few sort of interesting things, right? Like, why is this an interesting gift for John? He was very concerned with this. He's very concerned with tools and affordances and cognitive capacities. It was something that he, it was something that he had given a lot of thought to in some general sense. But, as a gift, I don't think it was probably, I know it was not something I had ever considered, and I don't think it was something he had considered. But when I gave it to him, he was touched. He found it very moving, right? Now, this is what people often express under these conditions. They get a really good gift and they say that they're touched. What does this mean, touched, right? Well, it means touched because in that moment, the gift is demonstrating to somebody that you have them internalized, that you have a mutual model of them, right? You've demonstrated it. You've demonstrated, essentially speaking, that you have given over some substantial share, right, of your cognitive capacity to modeling them, to having a mutual model of them. They feel touched because you have reached across the divide in some sense. The gift is a demonstration of this fact, right? And this is both why, gifts can be tremendously, right? They can be tremendously touching. They can be tremendously moving as a sign that somebody what? Gets you, right? That they get you, that they understand you, that they, right? Especially if it's something where it's well outside, maybe something that you've talked about, right? Or well outside your own particular thing. You get something, it's perfect, it's fitted to you in some important sense. And this is a demonstration of this kind of modeling, right? And in the reverse, of course, this is why a lot of the time, although people have a hard time putting their finger on it, right? This is why people often, I think, find it so upsetting when there is disparity, if it's a big one, in the gifting. So like a number of years ago, I worked with a client who had recently gone through a breakup. And in the course of this breakup, one of the things that, that she talked about was the fact that she intensely disliked cut flowers. And her partner used to bring her cut flowers all the time, no matter how often she sort of said, actually, I don't like cut flowers. He continued to bring cut flowers. And this was a kind of feature that ran through a great deal of the relationship. It often seemed as though he was making his decisions about the relationship not based on her in the specific, right? Her particular personality, her particular preferences, her particular utterances, but rather some kind of general category called girlfriend, right? That the thing one does is they bring flowers. And although she kept saying, like, I don't like cut flowers, right? This kept happening. And, it was upsetting, particularly because she had put a lot of effort into making thoughtful, connected gifts to this person. But like, why is that upsetting? Well, for one thing, it's upsetting for the basic reason that one feels that they are not being heard, right? They're not being heard, they are not being seen. But again, what does it mean to be heard and seen? It means for somebody to have internalized in this important way, to have created a mutual model, right, of your behavior. And this matters to us because, having done so is like it's a direct measure of, sort of commitment of cognitive resource in some important way. So this question of the hierarchy of gifts is one that's very interesting to me. I find gifting really interesting generally. It's sort of a fascinating general theoretical field to get thinking about gifting and what gifting means. But in this particular sense, I want to pay attention, obviously, to gifting within this mutual modeling narrative, because the hierarchy of gifts is essentially a direct test of mutual modeling in the same way as the Newlywed Game is a test of mutual modeling, right? Now, it is not simply romantic relationships that we mutually model, okay? So we, generally speaking, as human beings at a certain developmental stage, develop what is called theory of mind, right? And theory of mind is the notion that other people have minds distinct from your own, right? That they may have preferences different than your own. So a classic experiment in this respect is you take a baby and you put the baby in a high chair and you put down chocolate, M&Ms, something sweet, right? And you put down broccoli. And every baby in the world basically prefers chocolate, something sweet, to broccoli. Pretty much every baby in the world. So if you just offer them broccoli or something sweet, chocolate, they're going to take the chocolate. They're going to eat the chocolate. They're going to eat the chocolate. Okay. But then what you do is you go and you go in, and the experimenter, the adult, maybe a parent, comes in and picks up the broccoli and says, nom, 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 and eats the broccoli. And the kid will observe this, right? The kid will watch you delightfully, I love broccoli. At which point, if you offer the kid the chocolate or the broccoli, the kid often will pick up the broccoli and offer it to you. The kid is capable, the baby is capable of tracking a distinction between their preference and your preference. You like broccoli? Here you go. This is probably solving two problems at once, because also it's getting rid of the broccoli, which they would prefer to focus on the chocolate, right? You want broccoli? Here you go. Have broccoli, right? The point is that they're capable of figuring out that you, right, prefer the broccoli. Now, we know that there are sort of developmental stages. This is a big part of the other developmental psychologist I mentioned offhand, Piaget. But we know that there are developmental stages where people pick up more and more sophisticated sort of cognitive models and methods of processing. And one of these is understanding the distinction between the mental events that a kid has access to and the mental events that another person has access to, right? Distinguish between what information you have in your head and what information somebody has in your head. This is theory of mind. So one of the classic experiments for this, okay, is you get a kind of puppet show, okay? So you do this puppet show where somebody comes along, you know, this character comes along and da-da-da-da-da, and they're like, I'm going to put my sandwich in the treasure box. And so they put their sandwich in the treasure box here, okay? And then this character goes off screen, you know, or behind the thing. Okay, then another character comes along and the other character opens up the treasure box, reaches inside and takes a sandwich, ha ha ha, and moves the sandwich over here and puts it in this spot, hides it over here, and then goes off screen. Then the first character comes back, and then you ask the person that you're doing, where does he think the sandwich is? Where does he think the sandwich is, right? Now, below a certain age, okay, the kid is going to say, he thinks the sandwich is there, where it has been hidden the second time by the nefarious figure, right? The kid doesn't make a distinction between the information that they have access to and the information that, right, that these characters have access to. They don't make a distinction. Above a certain age, they do, right? They'll be like, he thinks it's over there in the chest, but it's not, right? The trick suddenly becomes obvious to them because they understand that they have different information than this character has. Theory of mind, okay? So think about these two things, the Broccoli preference, the ability to pick up preferences in this way, and this idea that people have access to different information than you do. There's an interesting list, incidentally. Quite a few animals have demonstrated theory of mind at this point, and you're going to see that this is something of a running theme in the course. My partner is very interested in animal cognition and keeps me on my toes in a certain sense by sort of giving me an endless stream of videos and things from like Franz de Waal, if you happen to follow that person on Facebook. They're a writer who's done a lot of interesting work around sort of primates and animal cognition. But she shows me sort of an endless series of videos with animals demonstrating cognitive capacities that often sort of surprise me with their sort of degree of sophistication. And so you'll hear this coming up a lot because it turns out that the cognitive capacities of animals, I suspect, are much closer to human capacities. Not that we do not have some, in some sense, uniquely sophisticated capacities. I think we do. But in many cases, that divide is not quite as broad or stark as you might think. So quite a few animals seem to demonstrate some degree of theory of mind. Okay. So the interesting thing here about theory of mind, one important thing, is that it seems, okay, from looking at the literature, that we develop theory of mind first, and then we develop sense of self. We develop theory of mind first, and then we develop sense of self, which is to say that before we have an idea of ourselves as a mind, we have an idea of other beings as having minds, right? So we may have preferences, okay, and recognize that another being is a mind with distinct preferences from our own, but not yet looped that insight around to realize that we have a mind. That metacognitive perspective of looking, right, cognition looking in on itself is not yet established. We establish the presence of minds out there first, and then we extrapolate from that, essentially speaking, to get our own sense of ourselves as a mind, okay? Now, this is very important. Why is this important? If you consider, right, the idea of internalization and mutual modeling, right, and you consider sort of patterns of behavior that emerge from that, and then you consider this question around theory of mind and the development of sort of the metacognitive, the self-conscious, what you get to is that in an important sense, Freud is right, because your parents have been living in your head longer than you have. Your parents have been living in your head longer than you have. What do I mean by that? You've been running a sophisticated mutual model of your parents, your primary caregivers, right? The people who were entrusted with your care. It's extremely important for you to internalize and to model their preferences. If they are not happy with you, you are in trouble, right? As a child, like as an infant especially, you're basically helpless, right? So internalizing all that material, internalizing their preferences, internalizing the rules, internalizing the ways in which they respond to things is an evolutionary survival task for you. You must do so. And so you're going to internalize massive amounts of behavioral information from your primary caregivers, right? And you're also going to do it with theory of mind. But the thing is that your own sense of yourself as a mind, your own self-conscious ego recognition comes online after that. So there is this highly sophisticated model, which is not just a list of propositions. It's not just a list of facts, right? The thing about the gifting model and the thing about the Newlywed Game idea is that because it is like a small internalized version, it behaves like them. It is capable of extrapolating. It's capable of projecting. It's capable of making inferential predictions. It behaves like them rather than simply being a list of facts about them or a series of snapshots of them, right? It is like a small version of them as best as you can construct. And it's been living in your head longer than you have. Now, I have yet to sort of cash this out, although it's maybe going into my book. I mean, it's definitely going into my book, but where is the question? You know, one of the interesting things that I think comes out of this is, you know, one of the reasons that we internalize these mutual models in the way we do is, of course, to provide us with patterns of action so that when we encounter situations, we already have these patterns of action to draw on, right? Think back to the box, crank, slide, button. Like we already have some idea of what to do, right? We internalize these patterns so that when we encounter a situation, we know kind of what to do, often in an unquestioning way, right? Not in a consciously processed way. We do things like the Christmas tree because they have been done, right? And our caregivers are sort of a primary mode for this. And I suspect, okay, that this may account in a large part for the phenomenon which is widely reported where the older people become, the more they find themselves behaving like their parents without having consciously intended to. So this is a very widely reported phenomenon, often to people's frustration. So people will, for instance, have, you know, criticisms of certain kinds of behaviors their own parents had in their direction, right? You know, my parents always did this, da, 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 da. And then they get to a certain point, they have their own kids and they find themselves doing the same thing, right? They find themselves doing the same thing. They didn't intend to, but they find themselves responding in very much the same way. And if they are sort of reflective, reasonably insightful, they may note this, but still have difficulty consciously intervening on it. Why? Why is this happening? And one reason is, of course, that, you know, these deep mutual models that have been in your head longer than you have are there as a repository of potential patterns of action. They're there to be like, oh, yeah, I recognize this situation. I know exactly what to do, right? So that you are not having to consciously come up with a response all the time, right? Parenting is one of those situations. Parenting is a situation where people are all, almost without variation, in over their head, right? Kids don't come with a manual, everybody says. Yes, of course they don't, although a certain measure of research and reflection, I think, goes a long way. And empathy never hurts. But the point is, right, like, what is there to draw on in terms of your behavior for these unfamiliar situations? And the answer is that you draw on the parental models that you had. As you get older, you're going to encounter more of those situations, which means you're going to tend to draw on more of those models, which isn't to say that you can't consciously intervene on those things. As we've talked about, there is a somewhat unique role for consciousness in the system because it does allow a sort of feedback mechanism that lets you reach down into an unconscious process, make it conscious, and thereby alter it. But that's not that easy, right? It's not that easy. It can be quite difficult to do. Intervening on your unconscious processes, in some ways, this is one of the most maddening phases in the therapeutic process. At first, you have no idea what's going on, right? You don't even realize what's wrong. It's like you're being smacked around in the dark. Then you eventually realize, oh, like now I see what's happening. But typically you see it in the aftermath of a situation, right? Oh, right, there was my complex. Then you see it while it's happening, but you're still powerless to intervene. You're like, oh no, this is happening, right? We'll talk considerably at considerably greater length about this because it's important and it speaks a lot to sort of the general processes we're talking about. And then eventually you see it coming, but you can't stop it. And then finally you see it coming and you can intervene. That is the sort of final step. And it's a necessary set of steps. Nobody really, in my experience, jumps ahead to the final step. Oh, now I see the problem, the pattern. Okay, great, I'll stop that. But that is the expectation that we have, both of ourselves and others, that, well, you see what you're doing, so just stop doing it, right? Except that generally speaking, it's not that simple. These patterns assert themselves and often do so under the radar of consciousness. And of course, the more unconscious they are, the more dissociated they are from your general consciousness. They'll operate on your own and then you'll wake up sort of after the fact, right? And go, oh God, what was I thinking, right? So they operate in this autonomous way. And oh God, what was I thinking kicks in. So the fact that you have internalized all these, cultural models and family culture models that you then begin to express, right? As you start hitting points in your life, so that this commonly reported thing, you've become more and more like your parent as you go. Without a certain degree of conscious intervention, sorting, filtering, rational process, what am I keeping and what am I changing, right? You can see very easily how that would emerge from an internalized mutual model as a pattern of action, right? Now that can be, in fact, in some ways, even more dramatic. And we'll talk a bit next week. We'll talk a little bit about my ex, who has some interesting experiences around her deceased parent, her mother. And we'll talk about that relative to talking about sort of the multiple self and like heard voices and things. It's very common. It's very commonly reported, actually, and not at all indicative of broader mental illness, although people often don't know that. They get kind of worried if they're hearing things, in the same way as people get worried when they're talking to themselves, even though we know the overwhelming number of people talk to themselves. And indeed, we know that talking to yourself is actually an important kind of technique for working things out cognitively and dialogically. So if you're worried that you talk to yourself and everybody else is flipped out, don't be. It's a highly effective way, actually, of working with your own mind. Okay, so the point that I want to get to is this question around mutual modeling. Now, that mutual modeling idea, and I'm not going to push on this too much further because I don't want to go too much over time here, but mutual modeling, generally speaking, is going to tend to internalize not merely specific individuals, but also what has been called in Mead's anthropology, the generalized other. The generalized other. So you can think about this, in a few different ways. One is, the generalized other of traffic. So for instance, my dad really dislikes coming down to Toronto. He lives about 2 hours north of the city, and he really dislikes coming down to Toronto because Toronto traffic is so bad. Toronto drivers are so bad. This is a generalized other. I mean, it's a generalization. Now, it may be the case, certainly relative to the traffic up north, right? There's a lot more traffic. It's perhaps more erratic, right? It's not exactly a mystery that, traffic tends to be worse in cities. And some cities are notorious for this, right? But, that idea of traffic is a kind of generalized other. This isn't a modeling of a bunch of unique individuals. It's a kind of human flow. You can see the same kind of generalized other operating anytime people are thinking about things categorically at all, right? So you may have an image of your cat, a specific cat, but you also maintain a generalized other of cats. What are cats like? You don't encounter each cat as a radical, unique individual who you have to learn from the ground up. You have certain baseline assumptions about cats as a category, right, as a generalized other, which you then extrapolate. And individual cats may differ from that, and then you sort of mark them off. You're like, whoa, that's an unfriendly cat. Note that those kinds of generalizations can often, create categorical issues. People have, a few scary encounters with a dog when they're little, right? And they may come to, I don't like dogs, right? Never mind that many dogs may be perfectly friendly and perfectly loving or whatever. They're generalized other, I don't like dogs. You can also see that kind of generalized other stuff at work. Basically, anytime people are categorically engaging in statements about race, class, nationality, gender, right? Politics. People construct the generalized other and then interact with it. Well, those kind of people, right? They're making generalizations. Those generalizations are almost always in some way, shape, or form false, right? They may contain certain amounts of like useful statistical information, right? That's true, right? So, you know, it is very likely the case, right, that statistically speaking, okay, men tend to be taller than women, which is to say people who have getting outside of sort of male, female, and various gender identifications per se. You know, if we're just going with basic category, you know, people who identify as men statistically are likely to be taller than people who identify as women, right? It's a feature of the sexual dimorphism of the species. So, right, it's a very basic idea. You can sort of make that generalization. In specific case, you can't speak to, but that particular generalization you can speak to, right? You statistically speaking. The problem is, of course, that people conflate their generalized other with instances, right? They rely heavily on the generalized other as a universal category. All X are Y, right? Now, as a shorthand, right? As a quick way of interacting with the world, we of course all do this to some extent. We all maintain certain kinds of categorical stereotypes because we can't not do that. It would be overwhelming for us to treat everything as a unique individual. But that kind of categorical carriage, if we can't effectively interface with the specifics of the situation, also causes us all kinds of problems. So, you know, anytime people are moving into a new romantic relationship, say, right, one of the issues they're going to be dealing with is, you know, their baggage. And what's baggage? Baggage is categorical assumptions from previous relationship. Categorical assumptions from previous relationship, right? If they've had a bunch of relationships that have gone in a certain direction, they're going to be extremely wary about this next one. Never mind that the next one may or may not, right, have those properties. If they've seen these preferences within, you know, the category of the people that they've been involved with, they may expect those preferences moving forward. And notice that that's sort of often more of a problem the fewer people that somebody has been involved with. If they've been involved with, you know, a number of people, they've dated a number of people, they may have a wider data set to draw on. Oh, there are actually, you know, many individual differences, which of course, obviously there are. They're dealing with individuals. But the categorical assumptions are giving them something to work off of initially. It is a generalized other. You know, and it's worth thinking about where you have generalized others, right? Which, as I pointed out, we do. People maintain generalized others, right? Which you can strenuously fight against, certainly, right? You can try to individualize. You can try to break down the absolutism of your thinking, the universalism of your thinking, right? All X are Y, right? And of course, there are cases where some all X are Y, right? For human beings, I think that there are quite a few sort of universals that you can apply. And it's probably not going to get up absolutely in a logical sense every single case, right? But it's broad enough that you can work with it for the most part. However, you want to fight against those when you're dealing with an individual, right? Because it is the case that they're an individual. They deserve to be treated as an individual, interacted with as an individual, right? Not as a generalized other. Okay, so this is likewise an important feature of internalization. And you'll see, of course, that generalized others are not just about sort of other beings. They can be about categories of experience and situations in the world and so on and so forth, right? If somebody says, I hate parties, right? They're interacting with a generalized other of party as a concept, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so internalization and mutual modeling. And I think you're going to see why both of these concepts are quite relevant to what we're doing going forward. So yeah, next up after this, we're going to talk about a little bit of intro to sort of Jungian psychodynamics. Yeah, we'll kind of push forward from there. Also, we'll be talking about dissociation and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's where we're gonna jump from here.